Hi everyone, my name is Trisna Aminwara. I'm from SBM ITB Jakarta from MBA program. Today I would like to share with you my presentation about the impact of carbon tax on small and medium energy producers, specifically in Indonesia. This topic caught my attention because I see a growing gap between how climate policy is designed, like carbon taxation, and the real conditions faced by small business, especially those in energy-intensive industry. Throughout this presentation, I will walk you through the policy background, the theoretical framework, and more importantly, how this policy actually affects cost structures, business continuity, and the resilience of SMEs in Indonesia. As we know, Indonesia has committed reducing greenhouse gas emission by up to 42% with international support and reaching net zero emissions by 2060. To help achieve that, the government introduced a carbon tax through Law Number 7 of 2021 about tax harmonization law. The policy itself starts with coal-fired power plants, but will gradually expand to other sectors. The energy sector alone contributes over 35% of national emissions. On the other hand, many SMEs in Indonesia are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, like electricity from coal-fired plants, diesel, and even firewood in rural areas. They play a massive role in our economy, yet they often have very limited access to clean energy technologies, green financing, or technical assistance. That's why we need a more adaptive and inclusive approach, like higher carbon rates, accessible financing schemes, and a clear roadmap that brings SMEs into the transition process. There are four main pillars that help us understand the role and design of carbon tax policies, especially when it comes to their implications for SMEs. First is the idea of carbon tax as a Pigovian tax. In economics, negative externalities happen when an activity like burning fossil fuels causes costs to society that aren't paid by the polluter. Things like health impacts, environmental degradation, or even climate-related disasters. Pigo proposed that governments could correct this market failure by imposing a tax that reflects those hidden social costs. So, in theory, a carbon tax puts a price on pollution. It encourages companies to reduce emissions, invest in cleaner technologies, or shift to greener production methods because suddenly pollution becomes expensive. Of course, in real-world policymaking, calculating the right carbon prices is complicated, but that's the principle: make polluters pay their fair share. Now, let's look at how this play out globally. Countries have taken different approaches to carbon pricing. Some apply fixed-rate carbon taxes like Sweden, which has one of the highest rates in the world. Others use market-based systems like cap-and-trade or emission trading schemes. What studies consistently show is that the success of these policies doesn't just depend on the price itself, but on the credibility and transparency of how it's implemented. In developing countries like Indonesia, we often see much lower carbon prices and limited scope of application. For example, our carbon tax currently applies only to coal power plants, and the price is far below the global average. That points to a readiness gap both in terms of fiscal capacity and institutional infrastructure. Now, do carbon taxes actually work? Empirically, studies say yes, but in nuance. A well-designed carbon tax can reduce emissions effectively, but the economic impact depends on the context. In high-income countries, carbon taxes tends to be paired with support programs, for example, subsidies for households, energy rebates, or green transition funds for business. In lower-income countries, that support system often doesn't exist. So, without compensation, carbon taxes can actually be regressive, meaning they hit lower-income groups or small business harder, since they have less room to absorb the cost. This is why distributional justice becomes important. The same tax can be fair or unfair, depending on who pays, who benefits, and what support is in place. And finally, SMEs. In both the academic and policy literature, there's a growing recognition that SMEs play a big role in emissions. One study in China found that over 50% of national carbon emissions came from micro, small, and medium enterprises. At the same time, SMEs are also the most vulnerable to rising energy prices. They often lack the capital to invest in clean technologies and don't benefit from large-scale government programs. Most don't even have the technical know-how to measure their own emissions. So if we design a carbon tax without thinking about their constraints, we risk pushing them into survival mode, cutting output, reducing staff, or even shutting down operations, rather than helping them transition. That's why literature emphasizes that SMEs must be part of the policy conversation, not just in terms of obligation, but also in terms of support. From microeconomic point of view, carbon tax increases production costs, especially for businesses that really heavily rely on fossil energy. This pushes the supply curve upward, meaning either higher prices or lower output. For SMEs, this can be a serious issue. Their demand is often price sensitive and they don't have the same bargaining power as big players. Let's say a small laundry business uses electric water heaters. If electricity prices go up due to the carbon tax, they either pass on the cost to customer and risk losing them or cut operations and profit. The problem is many SMEs cannot easily switch to clean alternatives. They lack the funding, the knowledge, or even basic access to energy efficiency solutions. So instead of triggering innovation, the carbon tax might end up becoming a burden. Now let's look at it from a distributional and institutional lens. Carbon taxes are not automatically regressive or progressive. It depends on who consumes what and how much. In Indonesia, many SMEs cannot just pass down the cost to consumers. Their profit margins are already tight, and they rarely receive compensatory support like subsidies or relief programs. Institutionally, there's a gap. Many SMEs aren't even aware of climate regulations. There's no user-friendly emissions reporting system. There is no clear roadmap for small businesses to follow. So what we're seeing is now the problem is not just a cost. It's a coordination and communications problem too. And that's a major reason why SMEs often resist climate policies. They feel punished without being given a real chance to adapt. Let's zoom in on SMEs in the Indonesian context. This business contribute around 60% of employment and 50% of economic value. They are not small in terms of impact, but the reality is they are vulnerable. Most rely on conventional energy. Many operate in areas where access to clean energy tech or green finance is extremely limited. Take for example a small aluminum workshop in West Java. They use diesel-fueled furnaces. When energy costs rise due to carbon tax, they cannot just switch to induction tech. It's expensive and there is no support program in place. Or we can consider a micro food producers in Kalimantan using subsidies LPG and off-grid power. Any hike in energy costs cuts directly into their operating margins. This is why it is important that SMEs aren't treated as afterthoughts in climate policy. They need to be part of the equation, not just for fairness, but for effectiveness too. Now let's take a closer look at how carbon tax actually affects small and medium energy producers in the field. First, we have the most direct impact on cost structures. Carbon tax increases energy input cost, which translates into higher production cost. For small businesses that are energy intensive, like those in manufacturing or food processing, this cuts directly into their already thin margins. They don't have the same economies of scale or bargaining power as large companies. So when energy becomes more expensive, many SMEs are forced to either reduce output, shorten operational hours, or cut staff. In the worst case, some may have to shut down temporarily. Second is the issue of access, or more accurately, the lack of access. Many SMEs simply don't have the financial or technical capacity to transition to cleaner technologies. Things like energy efficient machinery, solar panels, or even basic energy audits are still out of reach for a lot of small players. The third issue is inequality. Carbon tax can be regressive, especially when smaller businesses or lower income regions are hit harder. Many SMEs simply cannot pass the additional costs on to the customers because their market is extremely price sensitive. Regions that really heavily on coal, like parts of Kalimantan or Sumatra, are also most exposed because the energy mix is dirtier and alternatives are limited. So the tax ends up deepening the divide between small and big firms and between developed and less developed areas. Now, even the best tax policy won't work if the system around isn't ready. Indonesia's carbon tax still faces big challenges in institutional readiness. We don't have a reliable MRV system, for example, to track emissions outside the power sector. On top of that, many SMEs aren't fully aware of the regulation. There's limited outreach, minimal guidance, no clear roadmap for them to follow. That uncertainty leads to confusion and ultimately resistance. But it's not all negative. There is an upside. If the policy is supported properly, carbon tax, when implemented well, can encourage SMEs to think about energy efficiency. Cost pressures can be a motivation, but only if paired with the right tools. For example, training programs or simply platforms for monitoring energy use. If those are in place, then carbon tax becomes more than just a penalty. It becomes push towards positive change. In short, the big impact of carbon tax on SMEPs is multidimensional. It goes beyond just cost. It's because it's about capacity, equity, access, and institutional design. If we ignore those aspects, the policy may do more harm than good. But if we address them, SMEPs can actually become key drivers of Indonesia's green economy. So, what can be done? There are 5 key strategy policy recommendations. First, implement differentiated tax rates based on business size and energy intensity, not as one size fits for all model. Second, expand access to green financing, energy audit subsidies, and advisory services. Third, redistribute part of the carbon tax revenue to support SMEs through tax breaks, training programs, and also maybe targeted subsidies. Fourth, strengthen institutions, especially by building easy digital reporting tools, maybe that SMEs can actually use. And lastly, involve SMEs in policymaking, engage business associations, regional leaders, and SME networks so that the policy are actually grounded in reality. So, to wrap up, carbon tax is an essential tool for a low-carbon transition, but only if it's paired with a strategy that's fair and inclusive. If we ignore the needs of SMEs, we might reduce emissions, but at the cost of widening economic gaps and hurting businesses that are already struggling. The good news is, with the right support, SMEs can actually be agents of change, not just passive recipients of policy. I think that's all from me. I hope this presentation gave you a more grounded perspective on carbon tax and the real-world impact on small energy producers. Thank you.